There are crimes so disturbing that the human mind refuses to accept them, not because they are impossible, but because believing them would force us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. That children can plan, wait, and calculate death with patience adults rarely possess. History teaches us to fear monsters with weapons, with armies, with power. But what if the deadliest predators wore no threat on their faces at all? What if they stood quietly in the background, listening, watching, learning? In Burke County, Georgia, between 1851 and 1855, 17 men died under circumstances so ordinary they were dismissed as bad luck. Drownings, falls, crushed bones, fires, accidents stacked neatly on top of one another. The sheriff closed the files. The doctors signed the papers. The landowners blamed fate. No one suspected the truth, because no one ever thought to look at the twins. There is a quiet rule embedded deep inside human thinking, an unspoken agreement we rarely question, the belief that children are incapable of sustained, calculated violence. We tell ourselves that cruelty requires years of hardening, that murder demands emotional distance only adulthood can provide, and that patience enough to plan death comes only with age. History comforts us by painting killers as grown men with weapons, authority, or madness blazing clearly on their faces. But Burke County, Georgia, would become the place where that comforting lie collapsed entirely. Beginning in the spring of 1851, men began to die across 3 neighboring cotton plantations. Not weak men or drifters, but overseers, drivers, supervisors, men accustomed to giving pain rather than receiving it. They drowned in shallow water, fell from horses, were crushed by equipment, burned, or succumbed to sudden illness, each death isolated, reasonable, and tragically unremarkable. Local doctors shook their heads, chalking it up to the hazards of plantation life, signing certificates that read accidental, misadventure, or acts of God. Sheriff Clayton Morgan reviewed each case with methodical patience and closed every file the same way, because there were no wounds, no poisons, no witnesses, and no signs of human intent. What no one questioned was the pattern, because patterns only exist when you believe someone is capable of creating them. And no one, not the sheriff, not the doctors, not the plantation owners, could imagine that the common thread connecting the dead might be 2 silent children moving unseen through the corridors of power. The assumption that failed Burke County was not about violence. It was about imagination. To understand how 17 men could die without suspicion, you first have to understand the place that allowed it to happen. Hutchins Fields was not just a plantation, it was a system, an 800-acre machine built to convert human suffering into cotton and profit. Located a dozen miles south of Westboro, it stood as one of the most productive estates in Burke County, a white sea of cotton stretching farther than the eye could follow. The man who ran it, William Hutchins, believed deeply in order, numbers, and divine hierarchy, a deacon who measured morality in ledgers and margins. Every bale harvested, every tool repaired, every enslaved body was recorded, weighed, depreciated, and reduced to ink on paper. His study was lined wall to wall with leather-bound books, volumes that turned lives into statistics and pain into acceptable loss. His wife, Elena Hutchins, ruled the household with the same quiet efficiency, her authority calm, relentless, and absolute. Fear did not shout at Hutchins Fields, it whispered, settling into routines so familiar they felt invisible. It was into this world that Sarah and Margaret arrived in January of 1851, purchased from a trader passing through Augusta, listed simply as twin females, approximate age 12, domestic use. No surnames, no family history, no recorded origin, just blank space waiting to be filled. They arrived on a grey afternoon in the back of a transport wagon, surrounded by strangers, grief and confusion, yet carried themselves with an unnatural stillness. Robert Thaddeus Crane, the head overseer, processed them without ceremony, assigning them to kitchen and laundry work under his wife's supervision. In those first weeks, the twins barely registered as individuals at all. They spoke only when forced, moved without haste, and watched everything with eyes that never seemed distracted. While others lowered their heads to survive, Sarah and Margaret studied the plantation like engineers examining a flawed machine. They were not learning how to escape. They were learning how it worked. In the early months, Sarah and Margaret did nothing that could be called resistance, nothing that resembled rebellion, and nothing that invited punishment. They worked, they listened, and most importantly, they observed. While fear taught most people at Hutchins Fields how to disappear, the twins used invisibility as a weapon. From the kitchens, the laundry yards, and the long walks carrying water to the fields, they began assembling a silent map of the plantation. They memorized guard rotations, learned which paths were avoided after rain, noted which men preferred solitude, and which corners of the property fell briefly out of sight. Their attention lingered on timing rather than opportunity, because timing was what turned chaos into control. The older women whispered that the twins unnerved them, not because they were disobedient, but because they were never distracted, never startled, never careless. If Sarah reached for a basket, Margaret was already opening the door. Their movements so synchronized it felt less like cooperation and more like shared thought. It was during this period that their focus settled on Vernon Cushing, overseer of the eastern cotton fields. Cushing was 28 years old and carried cruelty with enthusiasm, using pain not as discipline but as entertainment. He singled out the elderly, the sick, and the women, administering punishment with a grin that lingered too long. For 3 weeks, the twins tracked him with the patience of predators, recording his habits without emotion. Every morning, 15 minutes after the dawn bell, Cushing rode alone through a narrow pine track, a muddy corridor carved by hooves and rain. He rode fast, confident in his power, convinced the land itself bent around him. The twins did not follow him. They waited, because watching told them everything they needed to know. The morning of March 28, 1851, arrived under a sky still bruised from the night's storm. The air thick with rain and red Georgia clay turned slick and treacherous. It was the kind of morning plantation men cursed but never feared, because they believed the land answered only to them. Before the dawn bell rang, Sarah and Margaret slipped from the kitchen quarters without a sound, moving through the wet grass as if the darkness itself had shaped them. They carried a single length of hemp rope, stolen days earlier from the stables and hidden beneath floorboards, not as a weapon, but as a calculation. Along the pine track Vernon Cushing rode each morning, 2 old trees formed a natural choke point, their roots pulling the mud into a deep, water-filled depression. This was where the twins stopped. Working quickly, with hands that never trembled, they stretched the rope low between the trunks, tying it at shin height, invisible in the gloom and perfectly placed for a galloping horse. They did not wait to admire their work. They stepped 20 yards into the brush and became part of the forest. When Cushing came riding through the path, confident and fast, the physics did the rest. The horse hit the rope and stopped violently, throwing its rider forward into the mud with bone-shaking force. Cushing landed face first, the air driven from his lungs, his mouth and nose filling with filthy water and clay. The panicked horse thrashed and rolled, pinning him into the muck as he gasped, helpless and unseen. By the time field hands found him an hour later, Vernon Cushing had drowned in inches of muddy rainwater. The twins had already retrieved the rope and returned to the kitchen, their hands dusted with flour, their faces calm. The sheriff called it an unfortunate riding accident. The doctor agreed. The grave was filled, and that night, in the darkness of the kitchen quarters, Sarah leaned close to Margaret and whispered a single number. 1. The death of Vernon Cushing did not bring relief to Hutchkins Fields. It brought something far more dangerous: confidence. Life resumed its rhythm almost immediately, because men like William Hutchkins had learned long ago that pausing for the dead cost money. A replacement was promoted. Douglas Pritchard, a career supervisor in his 40s, a man whose cruelty was quieter but no less lethal. Pritchard believed violence was a management tool, something to be applied efficiently without emotion, and it was that indifference that sealed his place on the twins' ledger. One afternoon in April, they watched him beat an elderly man named Samuel with a shovel handle for moving too slowly, kicking the feverish body as it lay collapsed in the dirt. That night, in the silence of the kitchen quarters, Sarah and Margaret made a decision without speaking. Pritchard's routine offered a different kind of opportunity. Unlike Cushing, he commuted from town and stored his saddle and tack in the plantation's tack room. Equipment trusted blindly by men who assumed authority made them invincible. Over days, the twins studied the leather girth strap that held his saddle in place, thick, worn, and strong enough to survive casual inspection. They did not cut it cleanly because destruction invites questions. Instead, Sarah used a shard of glass sharpened smooth on riverstone to score deep, careful lines along the underside of the leather, hidden from sight. The strap would hold under steady pressure, but fail under sudden stress, a delayed sentence waiting for the right moment. The next morning, Pritchard saddled his horse and rode out without suspicion, the damaged leather groaning softly as the hours passed. It wasn't until mid-morning, when the horse startled at a snake, that the trap completed itself. The compromised strap snapped with a sound like a gunshot, spinning the saddle violently sideways. Pritchard was thrown, his foot tangled in the stirrup, dragged screaming through cotton rows until his body finally broke free. He lingered for hours with crushed ribs and a fractured skull before dying. The verdict was equipment failure blamed on dry rot and age. No one thought to look closer. By early summer, a third man died inside the cotton gin, crushed by machinery after a catastrophic structural failure no one could explain. 3 deaths in 3 months should have triggered alarm, but instead it triggered denial. Men whispered about bad luck, cursed land, and divine punishment. And in the darkness, Sarah whispered another number to Margaret: 3. The pattern might have continued unnoticed if not for one fatal complication: memory. In May of 1852, a new overseer arrived at Hutchins Fields carrying something far more dangerous than a whip or a ledger: suspicion. James Pritchard was not like the others. He was the younger brother of Douglas Pritchard, the man who had died screaming in the Cotton Rose the year before. He did not come seeking profit or promotion. He came seeking answers. Lean, sharp-eyed, and restless, James treated the plantation like a crime scene rather than a workplace. He walked the paths where men had died, probing the mud with his cane, replaying events aloud as if daring the land to contradict him. He examined the gin house beams, questioned workers about belt tension and repairs, and lingered too long at the sites everyone else wanted to forget. Most unsettling of all, he noticed the twins, not because they stood out, but because they were always present. Quiet figures in the background, carrying water, clearing plates, moving through spaces that linked every death together. James began writing letters to his wife in South Carolina, outlining a theory he barely dared to believe, that these were not accidents at all, but acts of deliberate sabotage. The twins learned of this through whispers in the main house, through scraps of overheard conversation, and the sudden tightening of adult voices. For the first time, they felt pressure. Accidents invited dismissal. Investigation invited exposure. James Pritchard was not a man to be frightened by superstition or coincidence. He was a man who hunted patterns, and patterns once seen cannot be unseen. The twins understood something with absolute clarity. If James was allowed to keep digging, the entire structure they had built would collapse. This could not be another fall, another failure, another misfortune. This had to be an erasure. They turned their attention toward the stables where James slept beside oil-soaked timber, dry hay, and decades-old wood cured by Georgia heat. Fire, they knew, did not just kill. It consumed evidence. The fire that killed James Pritchard was meant to be the end of the story, a violent full stop that erased both the hunter and his questions. For a brief moment it worked. The stables burned to ash, the night filled with smoke and screaming animals, and by morning there was nothing left but twisted iron and charred earth. James Pritchard was declared dead from smoke inhalation, another unfortunate casualty in a place already drowning in misfortune. But the twins had made one mistake, a rare one. James's letters had already left Burke County. Days later, his widow arrived with them in hand, pages filled with doubt, suspicion, and a growing certainty that someone at Hutchins Fields was killing men on purpose. Sheriff Clayton Morgan could no longer ignore what his instincts had been warning him about for months. 7 dead men in 14 months was no longer coincidence. It was a pattern screaming to be acknowledged. Morgan reopened every file, spreading maps and reports across his desk, and for the first time, he overlaid one detail he had previously dismissed: presence. At nearly every site, in nearly every time frame, the twins appeared in the margins carrying water, delivering food, cleaning up after the chaos. Then came the report from Fairview Plantation. An overseer named Richard Blackwell survived an attempted fire and gave a description that chilled Morgan to the bone. 2 small figures, identical in height, moving together, running in perfect synchronization before vanishing into the tree line. Morgan felt the mental lock click open. The impossible explanation was suddenly the only one that fit. He realized he had already spoken to the killers, looked them in the eye, and dismissed them because his mind refused to accept what his logic now demanded. The hunt was no longer for a curse or a saboteur or an unseen adult enemy. It was for 2 13-year-old girls. Morgan rode back to Hutchins Fields with grim purpose, carrying a truth that terrified him more than any outlaw he had ever chased. Because monsters, he understood. Children who killed with patience and precision terrified him. Sarah and Margaret had mastered death, but they had also mastered foresight. By May of 1853, Hutchins Fields was no longer a hunting ground. They were hunted. Sheriff Morgan, armed with the impossible knowledge of their guilt, swept the plantation, questioning every worker, inspecting every building, and watching every shadow. The twins, however, had planned for this moment long before it arrived. On a moonless night, carrying only baskets of linens as camouflage, they slipped through the northern tree line, silent, fluid, untraceable. For 3 days they moved under the cover of darkness, navigating by the stars, hiding by day in drainage ditches and dense thickets, eating what they could steal, drinking from muddy creeks. Augusta became their sanctuary, a chaotic city where anonymity was safety. But two identical faces together were too memorable. They made a pact in a grove of oak trees. They would separate, assume new names, and never reunite until the world was safe. Sarah moved toward textile mills, blending into the throngs of workers, while Margaret vanished into domestic service. Sheriff Morgan tracked them to the city limits, but the trail went cold. Hutchkins' fields never recovered. William Hutchkins sold the land, broken by scandal and financial ruin. The story of the twins became legend, whispered to frighten overseers and children alike. Years later, Morgan received a single letter from Philadelphia, unsigned, elegant, and precise. "We survived. We built new lives. We never killed again. We were the consequences of your world. Do not look for us. We are gone." Records later confirmed a Sarah Hutchinson living quietly in Philadelphia and a Margaret Hutchinson in Boston, both dying of old age in the early 20th century. The ledgers are closed, the cotton fields overgrown, yet the question lingers. What are you capable of when survival is the only law that matters? Sarah and Margaret remain shadows in American history, not victims but architects of terrifying justice, watching from the past, silent, patient, and unbroken.